Okay, so welcome to the second in our series of the Environmental Humanities and Social Transformation Colloquium that Anne McClintock and I direct. It's wonderful to see everybody here, and it's a particular thrill to welcome Professor Adriana Petryna, who's the Edmund J. and Louise W. Kahn Professor in Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Petryna also directs the very well regarded and virtually unique MD Ph.D. program in anthropology at Penn. Professor Petryna is a richly interdisciplinary scholar, drawing on her training in both anthropology and architecture, and her books explore citizenship, medical anthropology, public health, environmental health, and architecture in wonderful detail and across a great range of geographical spaces. Her first book, Life Exposed, Biological Citizens and Chernobyl, won multiple prizes and remains painfully and urgently pertinent to the invasion of Ukraine today. Her second book, When Experiments Travel, Clinical Trials and the Global Search for Human Subjects, examines how the growth of the global pharmaceutical industry drives an unprecedented search for human test subjects, predominantly in the world's poorer countries. She has also co-edited two very resonant volumes, Global Pharmaceuticals, Ethics, Markets and Practices, and When People Come First, Critical Studies in Global Health. Professor Petryna will be talking today from her newest book, well, it's not just out from Princeton University Press. In fact, you're getting a jump on it. It's out in 6 days. So this is a kind of a sneak preview. And that book is called Horizon Work at the Edges of Knowledge in an Age of Runaway Climate Change. And focusing on firefighting particularly, Professor Petryna reimagines environmental futures in new ways that are both pragmatic and conceptually suggestive. So please join us in welcoming Adriana Petryna. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction and for this wonderful invitation, Rob. It's truly an honor and privilege to join you and to be speaking with you today. And I'm also so grateful to Anne McClintock. Both of your works have been so inspiring for so many. And I'm also grateful to the High Meadows Environmental Institute. Before I begin, I will just put on my PowerPoint and we shall begin. Let's see. Okay, so I hope everybody sees that. Great, thank you. So what I'll be presenting on today is a reflection of a knowledge of the dynamics, triggers, and sentinels of what has come to be called abrupt ecological change. Such change is often not subject to or does not always correspond to given models or predictions of altering climate patterns. Here I refer to things that we know: intensified storms, droughts, and wildfires that are breaking out of known metrics of frequency and spread. Projections and policies are faltering with respect to the pace of these changes, and often our heuristics are insufficient for grasping them. Nature itself, one can say, has entered a runaway state in which rapid shifts in long-established patterns, baselines, and historical trends become more than an amalgam of ecological surprises. They render the very concept of projection ineffectual. It went so fast, said a resident of a German village that was destroyed by floods that overwhelmed the country's flood alert system last year. You tried to do something and it was already too late. Such observations speak to the importance of enhancing infrastructure for previously unimaginable volumes of rain, but also to the limits of such enhancements in environments that increasingly deny a chance for an effective projection. In this talk, I want to chart an anthropological course between the more apocalyptic renderings of irreversible climate change on the one hand, and varieties of its denialism on the other. I want to argue that a mode of time horizoning, often employed in public policies, denies a foothold in felt and fast changing realities. And today, this in itself may be contributing to a rapid deterioration of knowledge about the future and hence our own ability to reckon with it. My larger work combines theoretical knowledge of abrupt ecological shifts with ethnographic attention to how degenerations in that knowledge are contended with, and specifically with the challenges that emergency service workers, particularly in the Western US, face on the ground. By the time it had ended, 2015 had been the worst wildfire year on record in the US. That year in California alone, about 3,400 wildfires were fought, 1,000 more than the average of the previous 5 years. Fire seasons are lasting almost 90 days longer than over the last 4 decades. Dispatchers are finding that too often there's nobody left to recruit to fight the fires. Military personnel, volunteers, and even prisoners are conscripted into response efforts. The truth is that it's hard to find stability in numbers. As the future unfolds, those numbers of area burnt, costs accrued for any particular year, and lives lost are becoming distant benchmarks of a runaway change. Over the past 5 years in which I've been doing this work, multiple numerical thresholds have been crossed. Well-defined fire seasons are starting to just be called fire years. California had seen the first ever wintertime megafires in December 2017, during what should have been the peak of the state's rainy season. As one observer of those fires noted, quote, "I was expecting to see snow on that mountain, and now the thing is on fire," unquote. So this process in which expectations are being constantly undercut by physical events takes me to the central theme in my new book, Horizon Work, At the Edges of Knowledge in an Age of Runaway Climate Change. It's based on several years of ethnography, a method associated with the discipline of anthropology, and that is usually based in an immersion in social worlds, and in my case, in scientific laboratory and emergency-related field settings that I'll refer to throughout the talk. Here I want to draw on that work and offer some insights about what I think of in terms of a very basic World I and World II distinction, obviously not an exhaustive list. But in World I, natural disasters can be contained and our projections hold. Knowledge is assumed to be cumulative, and to the extent that emergency services are available, they can be relied upon to maintain some semblance of stability. And tomorrow, we hope, will look like today. World II refuses to submit to that kind of control. The gulf between what is predictable and what occurs grows too large, and we fall into a chronic state in which only disastrous surprises emerge. Climate models have predicted how climate change will continue to wreak havoc across the globe, and additional advances in regional scale assessments have been made. But these models are imprecise in terms of forecasting when and where the next megafire or superstorm might be. In World II, projections degrade. Realities run away from received explanations and models, validating the idea of climate change as a race against time. If World I still exists for some, World II is already fully underway. And this is the world where emergency responders, wildfire scientists, fire managers, and other specialists I got to know do not have a luxury of pattern recognition. and where at times past experiences and knowledge are being rendered obsolete. All the while, as I'll be showing, they are attempting to build up ways of knowing the physics of World 2. In this effort, they can afford neither denialism nor defeatism, and are rather engaged in a mode of thinking that considers ecological disasters against a horizon of expectation in which they're still able to act. So in World 2, even as projections degrade, there's work to do, questions to ask, and new ways of problematizing the emergency that can hopefully help toward rapid reorientation to the challenge of stabilization. Or as one scientist put it to me, quote, "We will need more knowledge of how not to break things even further," unquote. Taking certain actions that preserve rather than break the option of sustaining life tomorrow means that we have to rethink not only infrastructure, but the knowledge bases that can undergird such projects of self-preservation. In the space of rapid ecological change, my inquiries have taken me to two interconnected fields. The first concerns ecological theorists and experimentalists who over the last decades have reckoned with large-scale ecosystem shifts. And they're attempting to define varieties of critical ecological thresholds that may entail irreversible change. And they are characterizing, if possible, early warning signals for such changes. Such modifications can appear anomalous at first. That wildfire season was long, but stabilize into a new state of ecosystem organization. Wildfire seasons are getting longer. Their impacts start to be observed at region-specific scales. That mountain that should be soaked in rain or covered in snow and thus resistant to fire is burning. What leads from one stage to the next in which the mountain burns in winter is in fact an amalgam of missed signals, an invisible present, a term coined by the ecologist John Magnuson and reflected in what scientists call an ecological regime shift, defined as a rapid modification in ecosystem dynamics, potentially leading to different ecosystems or sometimes unfathomable worlds. These dynamics took me to my second ethnographic field where I focused on ground level actors who are making sense of such shifts. Frontline emergency workers who are spending their time going back to the basics of physical phenomena like fire they thought they knew. They now find themselves in what one fire researcher simply called the upper limits of bad. In these upper limits, regime shifts are testing and exceeding an existing paradigm of emergency response. Reflecting on this paradigm, one firefighter put it to me, quote, "We need to get out from under the notion that people like us can be used to control nature, to suppress it or tip it back." What you're hearing are reflections about degrading capacity and degrading projections, where meaningful baselines upon which to improve knowledge or to gauge progress in a fight against fire are potentially being lost. In such a race against time, the expansion of a deliberative space amid cascading uncertainty, incomplete and sometimes faulty knowledge becomes crucial work. Or, as his colleague put it to me, we need to acquire a horizon, striking as if this were a thing, a kind of lever to pry time from the onrush of disaster. Or as he put it, quote, "For deciding what we are going to do over the next week, not like the next hour. But what I really mean is that we need to act in a way that we are not cutting off options for future generations. Options that include the option to adapt and to mitigate the harms of the climate emergency, the option of decreasing the chance of being continually blindsided by the frequency and scope of disasters, and the option to act before the circumstances for doing so disappear, such options, such freedoms really, are at risk of departing in World 2. So I want to consider this departure, this potential for a cutoff point in which humans can no longer intervene in two ways. First, in terms of how the limits of projection and of expertise puts pressure on emergency response, particularly to overwhelming wildfires that have themselves crossed some tipping point and where they are now qualitatively more extreme and hostile to human intervention. And second, in terms of how to build effective perceptual range. Here, I'll take you to Brazil and the United States, where I highlight efforts to forestall catastrophic conditions, and before such conditions, refuse solutions of any kind. Such efforts, as you'll see, involve a shift from inevitability, the point of no return that preoccupies so many, to exercises in capacity building that hold out the future as recoverable. How different forms of non-Indigenous and Indigenous expertise relate to each other without marginalizing one another points to crucial transformations that must inform any safeguarding efforts. In the various contexts in which I have worked over my anthropological life, I've searched for the humanism of our responses to overwhelming problems that all too often become objects of overly determined and short-sighted technical fixes, be it in the aftermath of a nuclear disaster or in the context of the climate emergency. Ideas of adaptation and resilience abound, but they don't capture the experiences, ethical choices, and incalculable losses that ripple through the normal timescales, the traditional time horizons of technocratic resolution, and that require a far more far-reaching imagination. For example, no one would have imagined that the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the site of the world's worst nuclear disaster in 1986, would be caught up in a war zone more than three decades later, or that Russians would choose to shell the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, but they did. At the same time, crisis mode thinking can cloud imaginations about the future. When certain notions of crisis are magnified, certain images of inevitability can lock in. Claiming every new crisis as unprecedented misses how human-caused ecological catastrophe has already been visited upon Indigenous peoples through colonial violence and dispossessions of land, as Indigenous scholars Candace Callison, Zoe Todd, and Kyle White and others remind us. Catastrophic thinking also runs the risk of what historian and philosopher of science Donna Haraway calls a surrender of a capacity to think. This too is a risky point when a certain desperate and often last-ditch intervention meant to stabilize a runaway situation, no matter how unproven, can seem like the only option available. Geoengineering is a prime example of such paralysis. Referring to large-scale interventions in offsetting planetary warming, it can involve the injection of billions of sulfur dioxide particles into the upper atmosphere, producing chemical clouds that reflect sunlight. But there isn't, and likely will never be, enough control to deal with the potential adverse outcomes of this experiment. Arguably, the suppression of wildfires, in the US at least, where considerable amounts of resources are made available and spent to tip nature back, falls into this class of technocratic and even quasi-militarized efforts towards nature's stabilization. Proposals that now include bombing wildfires into submission underscore how deeply assumptions about fighting wildfire can run. To be sure, cognitive dissonance is no way to adapt to any emergency, let alone the climate emergency. We can talk ourselves into the value of an aggressive technical fix and dismiss the question of how to collectively coordinate to produce more stable fire regimes, for example. While dissonance or nihilism can feed a distorted picture of inevitability, I hope to convince you that even as climate change is a foregone conclusion for the foreseeable future, the conditions that make fires burn catastrophically are not. This retreat from catastrophic thinking falls into a kind of activity that I've come to call horizon work, which is both an intellectual and practical labor that attempts to bring an unknown or runaway future into the present and to turn it into an object of thought and intervention. Such work is an imaginative exercise, first and foremost, one that is not limited to experts alone, and one that entails not only grappling with present and near future regime shifts, but also of retrieving horizons, desired future conditions, and of bringing them to bear on the present, where knowledge can be made actionable and not obsolete. That is, before evolving circumstances refuse human solutions of any kind. So to explore this looming edge a bit more, let me start with a very simple and somewhat iconic curve in the ecological sciences that may be familiar to some of you. This is the so-called regime shift curve, and I want to draw your attention to the bottom two-dimensional piece of this rendering for now, noting that what you see above corresponds to what you see at the bottom. So let's say that the line that is running to the point F2 represents some stable, unchanging state, a stable ecosystem, for example. But depending on the amount of pressure or perturbation, say from greenhouse gas emissions, that ecosystem can lose stability. And when it is pushed past some threshold, usually referred to as a tipping point, which is at F2, it free falls, so to speak, toward point F1 and onto a new state called an alternative stable state. The free fall itself happens along a dotted line. To just pause and think about the meaning of that dotted line, which suggests that the damages to an ecosystem that was tipped cannot be reversed along the same path that they were created or perpetrated. Dominant forms of expertise will become inadequate or perhaps even futile for such an endeavor, which suggests that response cannot be left to one set of experts, but must be undertaken by an array of independent, interdependent knowledge holders who, in their partial comprehension of patterns and shifts, can help better align emergency response with the nature of the challenges ahead. Indeed, regime shifts, again, fast makeovers of ecosystem dynamics with potentially permanent effects, are present everywhere, from the chemico-physical to the ecosystemic, from the mundane to the downright alarming. On the mundane end of the spectrum, a lake looks normal one day, smothered in blankets of thick algae the next, due to high levels of phosphates from agricultural runoff. Here's another example. One day, everything seems normal, perfectly calm. The next day, fish underbellies cover the entire lake as far as the eye can see. At smaller scales, once a lake is over a critical threshold or tipping point, so-called eutrophication and massive fish kills can result. But at larger scales, the notion of tipping points implies much more clarity than there actually is. Carbon dioxide concentrations, rising temperatures, and biotic shifts do not share a single threshold. And many ecosystems do not or may never have convincingly established tipping points. One can imagine instead what is a messy vastness of causally intertwined possibilities that make up a broad, undulating border of tipping points that is more like a cliff. How a stable Earth system can be tipped into that of a hothouse Earth that is a profoundly different biosphere in hotter climate conditions was the subject of a recent influential essay. The apparent suddenness of such shifts highlights problems of projection into futures to come. As questions of stabilization grow ever more urgent, asking how far, close, or beyond we are with respect to abstract tipping points may seem pointless. Even so, many would argue that knowledge of tipping points, however imprecise, is useful because it underscores an ever higher cost of inaction. As the late Thomas Lovejoy and Carlos Nobre, two prominent climate scientists, wrote, referring to an Amazonian tipping point and the need to stop deforestation, quote, "There is no point in discovering the precise tipping point by tipping it," unquote. 20% of the Brazilian Amazon has been deforested since 1970. Logging and rancher-set fires burning out of control and changing climate conditions are threatening another 20%. At 40%, and as precipitation decreases, the forest can be lost forever and replaced by savannas. Loss is not an abstraction for Sandra Guato Silva, a community leader and healer in the vast Pantanal, the planet's largest tropical wetland, which lost a third of its biome to catastrophic fires in 2020. She told a journalist that she mourns the loss of nature itself. Quote, "It makes me sick. The birds don't sing anymore. I no longer hear the song of the Chaco chachalaca bird. Even the jaguar that once scared me is suffering. That hurts me. I suffer from depression because of this. Now there is a hollow silence. I feel as though our freedom has left us," unquote. Yet in this century's first decade, a coalition of political, scientific, and economic actors pulled the Brazilian Amazon back from the brink. They did so by imposing critical moratoria on the soybean and cattle industries. They used satellite networks to spot instances of illegal logging or burning. Scientific agencies worked with the judiciary to create a sophisticated deforestation alert system, strengthening environmental enforcement and commodities supply chain traceability, holding perpetrators and sellers of deforested land products accountable. They also strengthened and helped demarcate territories where Indigenous peoples and other communities threatened by logging, mining, and farming continue to be the guardians of the forest, even as they have confronted or postponed the disappearance of their life worlds many times over, as Ailton Krenak, a philosopher and Brazilian indigenous leader of the Krenaki tribe, writes, and as they are losing their leaders to ongoing violence today. And this and more will be the subject of a conference in May on Amazonian leapfrogging, spearheaded by Princeton's Brazil Lab. In other words, it was coordinated acts of stabilization such as these, based in political will, technical expertise, and a guarantee of territorial and human rights, that allowed Brazil to reduce forest clearing in the Amazon by an astounding 80%, making carbon dioxide emissions from deforestation fall by almost 60% between 2004 and 2012. This decade-long effort made the forest available to do its critical work of absorbing carbon and also providing a space for kids to play. That know-how, fundamentally about recovering the time to act and not breaking but preserving options for future generations, remains available to be deployed again in Brazil and elsewhere. With this coordinated capacity building as an important example of what I think of as horizon work, let me now turn to the issue of intensifying wildfires and to efforts to align responses with the uncertain scope of the challenges ahead. Part 2, World 2. Over the past 5 years, boreal forests just south of the Arctic Circle have gone up in flames, In 2019, Australian bushfires emitted more CO2 than the country did that year. Siberian wildfires last year surpassed the annual carbon dioxide emissions of Germany. In Brazil, meanwhile, parts of the Amazon, an absorber of carbon, are turning into a source of carbon emissions. The precise contribution of wildfires to global carbon emissions and the related degree of warming is not known. Given the magnitudes of accumulated peril that are built in but hard to predict, it is more critical than ever to defund fossil fuels and to keep them in the ground. In the meantime, as recent protests in Glasgow demanded more action on holding global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius, beyond critically important target setting, what kind of response from the ground up can confront the ongoing damages? This somewhat dystopic image continues to give me pause. It's of a Greek firefighter wearing an aluminum heat-resistant uniform that, in an ever-expanding world of combustible biomass, invites us to reflect on how to organize responses in this kind of world, with what kinds of resources, no doubt always limited, and with what kinds of knowledges and practices. 2 decades ago, well-known anthropologists could imagine their field sites as stable grounds from which to derive knowledge about the future. Eric Wolf expressed the view that, quote, the search for explanation in anthropology can be cumulative, that knowledge and insights gained in the past generate new questions, and that new departures can incorporate the accomplishments of the past, unquote. Yet the problems of knowledge that are becoming so real today run counter to models of cumulative knowledge that Wolf valued. The more cumulative knowledge seems, the more we can find ourselves in an invisible present and in areas of observation where we are largely blind. Wildfire is a good place to illuminate the stakes of these crossroads in which firefighting organizations are obliged to revise knowledge that has been calibrated to worlds that in some ways no longer exist. Going to California once more, and where the massiveness of the problem of wildfire is matched by the most enviable amounts of resources, we see veritable small towns that pop up around wildfire suppression sites. Above and beyond the effects that stagnant wages, high stress, long hours, and increased fire activity have had on the people doing the hard physical labor on the ground, there is a level of operational precarity that hides in these images and that has been underappreciated. So I've spent time among scientists who are going back to the basics of how wildfire ignites and how it spreads, because in the words of Mark Finney of the Fire, Fuel, and Smoke Science program in Missoula, Montana, quote, we don't understand how fire is burning now to where it is yet to burn, unquote. This is a striking statement, especially if one considers that more than half of the US Forest Service's budget is now devoted to fighting fires. But a long-standing focus on fire suppression, especially after World War II, meant that the science of wildfire had been limited to an image of how fire should behave, that is, to an image of controllable wildfire. Cold War ballistics experts who once dominated the relatively small field of US wildfire science created, in some instances, what fire scientists described to me as hypothetical universes, where fire was assumed to spread according to some average or in some steady or predictable fashion. But it's the excursions or the non-steadiness that allow fire to spread. And so by erasing this critical dynamical feature, such hypothetical universes built faulty intuitions, conjuring images of wildfire that themselves could prompt misjudgments about their behaviors in the field. The philosopher of science Gaston Bachelard was onto something almost a century ago when he pointed out in his book, The Psychoanalysis of Fire, that certain physical entities like fire can outrun the techniques used to apprehend them. Fire is no longer a reality for science, he declared. The issue, these scientists say, is that firefighters have been sensing fire in the wrong way, using heat to intuit its danger, for example, or by looking at its peaks to sense where it might go next. Human sight and senses, they say, can generate their own sorts of miscues. As experiments in fire behavior suggest, it's what happens in between the peaks and dynamics inside the flames that are critical to understanding the horizontal forces with which wildfire spreads. And I'll just play a little clip from the lab that underscores these points, and these are the words of Mark Finney.
We don't understand the physics of how fire is able to go from where it's burning now to where it is yet to burn. Because flames are hot, they want to rise. Well, rising goes vertical. How is it that we get a horizontal force there to allow the fire to spread? How is the heat transferred?
So how does this matter? Coordinated fire management depends on a shared understanding of fire. How fast or slow is it moving? In what direction? As changing conditions are more readily felt, knowledge in the field about how fire spreads can degrade. Also, I want us to appreciate how much there's still to learn about the basic science of fire behavior, and to suggest that as ecological changes accrue, so too do concerns about whether we can all even see the same fire. These issues come to a head, these life and death issues come to a head in the field, in the US and increasingly around the world, when firefighters realize that they will be overwhelmed by flames with no escape. They will use these pop-up devices, emergency fire shelters that are considered last resort. The ones pictured here are experimental prototypes and no one is in them. They were originally encased in aluminum. Propane flames meant to mimic the high intensity fires of today melted the protective aluminum and exposed the heat resistant cloth underneath. Engineers recently tested NASA materials designed to thermally protect spacecraft upon atmospheric re-entry, but those materials did not hold up well against fire temperatures on Earth. In unhinged ecological fields, lives are at stake. Wildfire trainers are rebuilding what they call situational awareness. Only this time they have to change intuitions about fire. For example, they tell firefighters to throw away their old mental slides, a term they used to refer to once informative guides to fire behavior that can now lead to its serious underestimation. Trust in patterns has become an occupational hazard. Overcoming such a hazard may not be a matter of better, fast thinking. A model of expertise in which expert knowledge accumulates through repetitive practice within relatively stable environments. Where knowledge is assumed to be cumulative or honed through experience, it is in certain respects diminishing as a symptom of method and circumstance being profoundly misaligned. This diminishment can be appreciated historically. For example, the US Forest Service touts a 98% success rate in stopping fires with aggressive action. But that success rate, by some accounts, has not changed very much since the early 20th century, when large-scale fire suppression was first introduced in the US. Back then, firefighting worked because indigenous fire management practices of active burning, a product of over 10,000 years of fire use across ancestral lands, made it easy to have this high success rate. Today, Fire suppression has made the land far more combustible, so much so that in one fire scientist's words, quote, "We need DC-10s and 747s and every bit of technological paraphernalia to achieve the same success rate. California has the biggest military firefighting force in the entire world, and they still have some of the worst fires, right? I mean, isn't anybody asking the hard question?" Arguably, the firefighting tool does not quite know the material that it is fighting with. And at this critical juncture, it helps to specify how deeply ingrained illusions of control hinder progress, but also how certain collective efforts can expand the breadth of resources with which abrupt changes in fire can be responded to. So in my remaining 10 minutes, I'll expand on the role of Indigenous fire management, and then I will close with some larger thoughts on the theme of horizon work. As part of that expansion of resources, we have to turn to the legacy of colonial violence in the US and elsewhere, recognizing that the logics of control and suppression of wildfire imported from Europe and adopted here to enact environmentally destructive commercial extraction, such as logging, have been part of what Muskogee Creek geographer Laura Harjo calls the eliminatory work of the settler colonial state. Such work involves the exclusion of Indigenous knowledge and myriad relations in lands that were once sculpted by fire behaviors that were made to occur reliably across millennia. As Indigenous scholars have argued, forms of Indigenous biophysical stewardship, a term used by Indigenous research ecologist Frank Lake, are not a supplement to dominant settler practices. Arguably, they set the standard for such practices and can outperform them in terms of their durability. So the usual go-to proof for this claim are tree rings. And I want to draw your attention to the darkest area on the cross section of this particular tree stump, which indicates constant exposure to low intensity fires. Tellingly, the darkened area representing fire's historical role cuts off right at the year 1900, precisely when fire suppression was first introduced. 400-year-old dead and living ponderosa pines from the Western US show that fires burned them once every 10 to 15 years. Those fires also crafted microhabitats for diverse plants and animals, and their variable microclimates, these habitats could slow or stop fires. Importantly, that fires were much more frequent, but of a low intensity nature, made human coordination around them possible, and fires themselves were not catastrophic, but safer to engage. So here you're seeing how fire is being returned to the land. In addition to the work of suppressing fires on their reservation, the Flathead, the Salish Kootenai tribes of Western Montana burn a considerable amount of land every year. They have created a model program that mimics fire's historical role. They do this to protect their lands and culturally significant sites from fire conditions that are becoming hostile to human intervention, as well as to maintain as best as possible a possibility for intervening in future fire conditions. Historically, fine-scale practices like these could achieve stabilization within highly dynamic environments that include breathtaking mountains rising 10,000 feet in the Northern Rockies. Here, a burn scar from one wildfire could productively overlap with the burn scars of another, providing overlaps that created vital edges and perimeters for fires to move. The Salish Kootenai people welcomed the lightning that caused fires, as fires iterated across the landscape as a gift, in the words of a former education specialist with the tribes, Jermaine White. They did so in ways that made the Salish and other indigenous groups into highly effective geoengineers. To think with Candace Callison, stability isn't an abstraction. It consists of a set of real relations among human, non-human, and more than human beings, which begs the question, is the problem of wildfire unprecedented, different from what it was before? Indigenous counter-narratives and practices illuminate the ethical stakes of this crossroad, encountering policies and colonial legacies that make wildfire ever more catastrophic. They point to other futures that are already underway. Yet the antidote to the attempted suppression of these futures is not anti-fire suppression, but rather a form of response in which method and circumstance align. Rather than deploying anachronistic mental slides and more resources, i.e. people, institutions will need to support the reality of changing conditions through a different kind of social labor of crisis. Here, a Karuk tribal crew member is igniting cultural burns during a training and exchange program. Firefighters now work on the leading edge of a bold experiment in how collective responsibilities should be rethought amid hostile climate futures. Former wildland firefighter Timothy Inglesby suggests that firefighter identities should be reimagined to engage, quote, a full spectrum of possible roles and duties, unquote. At the same time, what sociologist Carrie Norgard, working with the Karuk tribe, calls knowledge sovereignty must be maintained, allowing cultural burning despite ongoing legal barriers against it. As more carbon dioxide is pumped into the atmosphere, the bigger question here is, what would it mean to break from a path of inevitability with our forests, oceans, and lives intact? There are plenty of ways to answer this question and to enact horizon work in ways that don't reproduce the logics of colonial dispossession and that can mitigate harm. This is also to say that horizon work can make fire real in other terms, not just as costly rubble, a quasi-military adversary, or an unstoppable force of nature, but as the stuff of reimagined responses and objectives. In exploring climate futures in terms of horizoning, I shifted the focus from inevitability, a point of no return that preoccupies so many, to the cultural, technical, and otherwise human exercises in capacity building that hold out the future as recoverable. Just as the climate is changing and expectations for how the environment should act are constantly being shattered, so too are efforts underway to preserve a basic capacity to respond to future shocks. Acquiring a horizon means changing cultural expectations around wildfire control. It means revising knowledge calibrated to conditions that no longer exist. It means facing the fact that responding to disasters may themselves be disappearing. Acquiring a horizon also entails commitments to safeguarding what hasn't been lost. It means acknowledging the scales of accumulated peril that exist below the threshold of scientific perception, but also that this void where projection fails can also inspire spaces of collective action for recoverable futures. Here, horizons become instruments, helping us to carve out effective perceptual range and to guard against threats of being blindsided. Seafarers, especially in dense fog or storms, have a special ability to grasp the kinetics of real danger. They demarcate increments using known parameters, the smell of a certain forest, certain patterns in tidal waters, and deduce their position vis-a-vis previously estimated locations or fixes. This is not a technical fix, but a continual capacity for recalibration, a form of work that makes good on faulty intuition and incomplete knowledge, allowing movement forward or preventing the crash or disappearance of an entire system, be it a boat, a lake, a forest, or a world. In this way, as I've suggested, horizons cut a path in the direction of an all too real human struggle to maintain responsive capacity. The struggle is not only about achieving better projections of risk or uncertainty, it's about cognizance of jeopardy and about recovering the time in which such cognizance can be made actionable, not obsolete. Rather than capitulating or running toward fear, horizoning becomes a wayfinding tool that plumbs the lines of a durable world. Those lines run straight through violent colonial legacies, misguided policies, and ongoing structural inequalities that place Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities on the front lines of climate change. They run through the extractive regimes generating massive transfers of risk that overdetermine who is protected and who is sacrificed in environmental regime shifts. Somewhere along the way, it won't be technical fixes like geoengineering, but rather coordinated acts of stabilization based in political will and collective responsibility that can reverse increasingly unlivable planetary conditions and that can maintain a promise of futurity. When destructiveness obliges us to revise knowledge calibrated to conditions that no longer exist, marking horizons beyond which the world as we know it disappears, is itself an exercise in delimiting a knowable and thus livable world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adriana, for this very wide-ranging and inspiring talk. So we will take question time. We have about 35 minutes, and I will keep an eye out both for raised hands and also an eye on the chat. So let's open it up to questions.
I have a question. Sorry.
Yeah, go right ahead. Yeah, man.
And okay. Okay, so hello, Adriana.
Hi, how are you?
Nice to see you again. So thank you so much for this exciting lecture. First of all, I have to congratulate you for your efforts in helping us building a language to research wildfire in the humanities. I have been doing research on wildfire, and I know the methodological challenge involved in this. So my question is about knowledge exchange on fire behavior, and in particular about a tension between the physical models and the biological models used to think on fire behavior. In my research with fire managers in Brazil, I realized that fire colleagues used to see fire behavior from the physical aspects of combustion. But in contrast, my colleagues, indigenous firefighters, treat fire through a biological approach. So in the sense that it's a kind of animal that eats, rises, walks, and dies. So this tension between physical and biological aspects of fire. But at the same time, fire colleagues need help from indigenous people to conduct their burning experiments. It's really interesting to think about this exchange, knowledge exchange. So my question is how this knowledge interchange between indigenous and scientists are happening here in US?
Yeah, so the Salish, Confederated Salish Kootenai tribe has a model fuels treatment program in which they are very active in training other tribal members and also federal agencies and private agencies, I believe, in their craft of prescribed fire. And so I think there's incredible importance that they place on this mutual interagency exchange across different types of agencies. And I think that the, there, as you probably know, there's problems with prescribed fire burning in terms of, the public acceptance of widespread prescribed burning. But I think that the more people understand the value and just the way in which cultural burning or prescribed burning has been honed through millennia of observation and experimentation and spiritual interaction with the natural world, that there is in fact a kind of what one of my interlocutors called a kind of different operating system to fire. So, in a straightforward physical sense, fire is a manipulation of heat, fuel, and oxygen. And you can manipulate fire depending on whether you add or subtract any of those three things. But that kind of physical model doesn't necessarily, it doesn't conform at all to the way in which the sense of responsibility for managing the natural world through fire has been evolving through many, many generations. And I think the biological is not necessarily a kind of animal. I think the operative system is one in which fire can be kind of iterative and duplicative in nature. And I'm using, again, borrowing from some of the words and thoughts of Indigenous fire managers. And so, again, it's something that we tend to, and there's a reciprocal nature to this operative system. And in some sense, fire in a cosmological sense is an extraordinary gift that remains intact or must remain intact, because it ensures the growth of foodstuffs. There's so many reasons to use fire, or the way in which fire was used was really linked to a broad, set of livelihood conditions. And so that's where the biological would be. It wouldn't be a specific kind of animal form, but it would be like, this is the stuff of life. This is what we need in order to make sure that our first foods come up in the spring. For example, camas bulbs, that we can even modulate the height of some of our berry bushes. We can, so the scalar potentials of fire are enormous, from the very sort of micro habitats to large scale management of fire. And again, fire is iterative and reduplicative, and it does a lot of work on many different scales in terms of supporting life.
Great, thanks. Other questions? Thanks. Anne, yeah.
Thank you so much, Adriana, for what a brilliantly suggestive talk. I actually have a writerly question, a thinkerly question. I'm curious about how you yourself arrived at this wonderful figure, this mode of thinking of horizon work. And you start your talk by describing nature as entering a kind of runaway state where scientific knowledgeability collapses, and yet it's doing so in the context of a long legacy of seeing and post-enlightenment entitlement of control over nature and control over fire as enemy, as hostile. And you just gave a beautiful evocation of an alternative indigenous immersion where fire is a gift or its kin. But I'm curious just if you could talk a little bit about your own process, how as an anthropologist working with people in the aftermath of Chernobyl, now working with firefighters in very embodied, immersive situations, how you've come across this notion of horizon work?
Oh, thank you, Anne. Thank you. I think that it doesn't come, it comes from the people with whom I work, and it wasn't something that I think when I heard one of the fire scientists say we need to acquire horizon, at that moment in my fieldwork, it clicked. Yes, I completely know that this is not a metaphor that he's talking about. This is really like a tool, like we really don't have a way to think about the future beyond this immediate present that we're sort of entangled in terms of responding to emergency and crises. And so I think that was a real turn for me, because I thought that at that moment, I felt that there is some kind of agency over this image of the runaway. I like many, I think, are trying to figure out, well, where's this all headed toward? How do we deal with it? How can we engage and speak to audiences in a way that help shape the stakes of the climate crisis? And when I began the work, it wasn't with firefighters. I actually was interviewing sort of regime shift scientists, people like lake ecologists and people who work on issues around critical thresholds and modeling. And it just happened that I had the opportunity to speak with a wildland firefighter in New Mexico when I was there. And I had this narrative in my mind that, well, wildfires are accelerating because of climate change, right? That was the causal structure that I had in mind. And he disabused me of that causal structure. He said, look, you can't say that. You can't say, of course, drought and, rising temperatures and all that stuff. But for me as a firefighter, if the story is about climate change, I lose the leverage institutionally to really think about this 100 years of fire suppression that has created these unrealistic expectations in the public around what we can do with fire. And it puts firefighters at risk, so there's a safety concern there. That's where his concerns were the greatest. And so when I went and talked to more fire, because then he led me down this path of fire, the fire scientists and the more wildland firefighters, and I heard this, we need to acquire horizon. It just sort of, really impressed me that horizon is one in which, not only, science, but the public emergency response has to come together and really see the risks of this model of suppression, especially in fast changing climate conditions. So we're at a particular kind of tipping point, which is not an abstract tipping point. It's not a line. It's actually a question of whether or not, what is the role of the wildland firefighter? And so sometimes we talk about a kind of quasi-militarization of a firefighting force, and that's not where they want things to go. I mean, wildland firefighters are not soldiers. They're not expected to fight fire like, soldiers fight, other soldiers. They're not expected to sacrifice with their lives. Their original title was forestry technician. That's actually their job title, at least in the federal service. And so we have to think collectively around this horizon, and so this then invites different kinds of knowledges, different kinds of histories, a reckoning with the legacies, the colonial legacies, guaranteeing sovereignty, fire sovereignty, land sovereignty, so that these other kinds of practices can begin to reshape the way in which we engage the land, not as an enemy. Of course, fire is a scary thing. I'm not saying it's not a scary thing. I'm not saying that prevention burns will stop mega fires, but there has to be a switch away from the expectation that we can put wildland firefighters at risk in that way. So what is a horizon what is horizon work is both social, technical, political, involving Indigenous, non-Indigenous actors in a new kind of alignment of power and knowledge, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Yeah, Mike.
Thanks so very much, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Thanks so very much. I really, really enjoyed your talk, and it resonates a lot with my own research. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about where this pushes up against rights regimes. So the rights of, there's a sort of globalization of rights. There's this standardization and universalization of human rights to the environment, etc. And I imagine that climate change, but also fire, interacts with these rights regimes across different scales. So through your research, I wonder if you could speak a little to, where you've seen these interactions happen.
Yeah, that's very interesting. In my earlier work on the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, I came up with this concept of biological citizenship, in which I was thinking about the way in which lives that are so desperately at risk try to find a footing in rights regimes and often don't make it there. And so, through very selective mechanisms, do some become protected, those who had been exposed. And I think Stephen Pine was a preeminent fire historian. I mean, and has influenced so many people with whom I spoke profoundly. Talks about biotic citizenship. I think it might have been a throwaway line, but I just stayed in my mind, this biotic citizenship, which I think relates to this rights of nature question that you're raising, that affords nature its own agency, and to recognize that these interactions between humans and non-humans and more than humans are very consequential, and that there's just we're long past that place where we can pretend that they're not consequential. And so I think it's absolutely important to think about nature and rights to nature types of regimes. My colleague Christina Lyons is thinking about that a lot. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's just sort of a start. Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe I could add a question, Adriana, which is, so it's a rather broad brush question, but the relationship in California between the housing crisis and the fire crisis. Thinking of the sort of people moving into canyon lands and wildlands, either because of the, maybe for wealthier people, perhaps a cachet of living close to nature, and then also for people working in service industry and lower paying jobs, having to commute from wildlands because the cities are unaffordable. I mean, that's a very, as I say, a very broad brush question, but it's something that really came up as you were talking. Yeah.
No, I think it's, the concept of the wildland urban interface, something that I think grew out of sometimes in the 1980s when fire research lost its funding and was sort of looking for other avenues of funding. Again, this is a history that Stephen Pine has written about, created this category of the wildland urban interface. And so we talk about Californians, so many Californians living in this wildland urban interface. And it's a misnomer because it assumes that there's a fixed boundary between wildland and urban spaces. And it also assumes that fire doesn't have embers and doesn't cross those geographic boundaries. It also assumes that what we might call wildfires are actually just urban fires or suburban fires, suburban urban conflagrations. And so in a very important sense, we haven't come to terms with the idea of how we live in these environments, you know, structurally, how to, in some ways, it's inevitable that people will live in these environments. Jack Cohen has, somebody who I work with very closely, interviewed many times, came up with a concept that is widespread now, the home ignition zone, in which homeowners can kind of prepare themselves in different sort of concrete ways for wildfires, essentially turning your house into what would approximate like a block of wood, because we know, you know, blocks of wood don't burn as readily. So getting rid of the kindling and all of that stuff. So, you know, there's this media aspect to wildfire, you know, the raging wildfire, for example, the Camp Fire. You know, there was a media report that it's burning 8,000 football fields per minute. And it was just this apocalyptic image. And so I called up, I emailed Jack and talked to him about this. And I said, well, what does this mean? And he said, well, have you looked at images of Paradise? Have you looked at the town? And I said, okay, well, let's find some pictures. And I actually have one here. And he said, well, what do you see? And this is how fire scientists always talk to me. Well, what do you see? Because they assume I'm part of the public that sees fires in these kind of you know, ways that are apocalyptic and so forth. But anyway, so this was one of the photos. I don't know if you could see this. Mm-hmm. Why isn't it there? Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, well, so I'll just keep it there. So if you look at this photo, this is a photo of Paradise, one of the housing units that burned. So what does anybody notice about this? There's something that you can tell me about this photo that might strike you? What's burned and what's not burned?
A bunch of trees around it that seem like they're standing just fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is an urban conflagration. This is not the Camp Fire wildfire. The trees are there because the fire did not reach a certain point of heat and intensity to actually burn those trees. What burned were the building units that are not built in a way to sustain fires. And in fact, the fire embers will go through vents and come inside the house and create the fire from the inside and sort of blow up these structures from the inside. And of course, we know there was poorly designed egress for Paradise. So these are human aspects that have not been worked through with respect to life in wildland-urban interfaces, and that put many different people at risk. I mean, these people who are living here are not wealthy, you know, like you said, Rob, they were commuting, or they were, you know, low to middle income people. And so we have to think very seriously about how we design and live in these wildland urban interfaces. But we don't want to say this was a raging wildfire, you know, linked to climate change. Yes, of course, climate change is an issue, but we have to look at what kinds of human interventions are actually relevant in the immediate sense here in terms of protecting not only people living there, but also the wildland firefighters who are asked to protect people there as well.
Great, thank you. Anne, yes.
Yeah, maybe just a follow-up question to that. It may seem somewhat antithetical, but out of that, the embers, the image of those embers, I was just talking with some of my students about Amitav Ghosh's great derangement, And he has a wonderful sentence that nowhere is far away anymore. And so I was wondering if you've talked incredibly evocatively about different ways of figuring time, and you talked about bringing the future into the present as a way of, as allowing and inviting modes of action. But I'm wondering if also, if it invites us, if fire invites us to think in different ways, I guess along the ways that Amitav Ghosh is thinking, that nothing is very far away, and that there's some theories about melting of the ice caps as being enhanced or amplified by the spread of soot and from the fires, and pollution traveling from the west coast to the east coast. So I'm wondering if at the same time that we're being asked to think about, you've got a very suggestive, I'm trying to capture it, spectrum of incremental calibration of time, but if we're doing that as well in terms of planetary space and interconnection.
Yeah, and thank you. I mean, your work is so fundamental to making those connections in the way that you think about sort of the interlinked crises of our times, militarization, climate chaos, and mass displacement of people and human and animals. And you have this wonderful way of talking about it as alternative fugue time. And I think that what your work points out so importantly is how we have to make these interlinked crises, the links between these crises visible, right? And so we see these dramatic changes in so many different ecosystems, but we seem to lose a connection with their causalities, and those causalities are complex. And again, we can look at wildfire in the West, we can look at the Amazonian fires, and think about different kinds of narratives that can open up approaches to understanding these ecosystems that really shed light on not only the ecological, but the political economic logic in which these fires are happening, or in which this destruction is taking place. And so I like Ghosh's notion of the great derangement. It makes so much sense because it resonates so much in terms of the work that I've done with the fire scientists, because that's kind of what they're talking about. They're talking about a kind of cognitive dissonance with fire, to the point that even one incident commander said, we're in a knife fight with fire. I mean, you can't be in a knife fight with fire, right? That's a great derangement right there. But how do we think about the entry points to create larger narratives around these most basic assumptions about the environment and what causes its change, and how can we give more people a stake in that change and its meaning, and how can we open up time? I guess when I think of Horizon work, I'm thinking about the apocalyptic narrative versus the one that can open up time, and that's the kind of thinking that a lot of people have done, Indigenous people have done over many millennia. And how do you create the conditions for responsiveness to these large scale disasters? I mean, of course, some things are, hard to change at this point. But I think it can't be just flattened by this idea of adaptability, because we know how inequity works within that, framing of things. But we have to change our cognitive models about how we think about change and the future, and what we can do as stakeholders and perpetrators as well, that may or may not grant us a certain borrowed time, I guess you might call it.
Thank you.
Any other questions people have? Maybe I'll just add one last one. Adriana, you were talking about the sort of the uncertainty around how fire spreads horizontally, or the uncertain science of that. And I don't know if this term applies in the US, but I know in Australia they talk about ember attacks, which again is a kind of a militarized term. So outside there would be a fire in the Blue Mountains or somewhere like 50 miles from Sydney. And in the suburbs, there would be blue gum trees, eucalyptus trees, and they would be subjected to what's called an ember attack. And so that would be one narrative of horizontal spread. Wind is a factor, but I wonder what the other elements were in the sort of mystery of horizontal burning.
It's very interesting. You talk about ember attacks. I think that might be related to the fact that increasingly live vegetation is burning. And so that's been a real source of intrigue and not enough research. So when eucalyptus, for example, eucalyptus leaves have very volatile oils in them. And so if you look very closely, and they've done experiments, the fire, they burn in explosive kinds of ways. And so if you scale this up across, some, area, these will look like, explosions. In the US, we have crown fires, which are these fast moving fires that move across ponderosa pines, or, essentially live vegetation. So the physics, the description of how things that shouldn't be burning are burning is not, we don't have those. We don't have that science yet for the Amazon, which is a tropical forest. There's so many places where this basic fire science has to evolve in a sense. I don't know, I get really caught up in the science because I think it's so interesting. So the horizontal force with which fire spreads is essentially a convective force, and firefighters know this. When a fire is coming at you, the air is getting sucked out around you, and it's very destabilizing for them. It comes as a roar. And this is because fires entrain. They're sucking up oxygen all the time, but when they get trapped, they are like animals, when they get trapped in canyons or in certain topographies, they can't entrain from the side. So they're entraining from ahead of them. And that's why that's the most dangerous place for firefighters to be. They absolutely cannot be ahead of that fire in a canyon, obviously, because it's just coming right at them. There have been a lot of near misses that in my research, I talk a lot about near misses and the ways in which firefighters reflect on this question of situational awareness. Even the ones that are like the most well-trained will tell you there'll always be conditions where they're overwhelmed and they should have thought differently, but there aren't the tools really yet to translate, to translate the fire science to fire management. And there's resistance to it as well. If fire becomes more complicated, if it doesn't spread like an ellipse, for example, it's been modeled as an ellipse fire spread for decades now. You see these graphs of fires as ellipses in management offices, or if you can't imagine that fire spreads uniformly according to some average, well, then how does it spread? How are we supposed to build a common operative picture, so to speak, in order to respond to it? What fire scientists say, at least the ones that I talk to in Missoula, Montana, who really do sort of the premier fire research in the US, among other labs, is that we have to do those translations more effectively so that we know exactly when we can't send firefighters into these fields. And they're becoming more complicated because live vegetation is burning. Things that are burning that shouldn't be burning are burning. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for a wonderful talk and an equally wonderful and rich question time. And congratulations on the book. And I believe you can pre-order it. 6 days, you can actually go into Labyrinth and order a physical copy. And there will be another event at Labyrinth when Adriana and I will be talking on, what date is that?
Oh, I think it's the 21st.
21st, maybe. Okay. Anyway, watch that spot.
I think.
Okay. Well, congratulations again, and many thanks for your presentation.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. Bye-bye.